So welcome everyone to the Core Coffee Chat. And our topic today is supporting undocumented individuals and families during and after COVID-19. And we have some great guests with us today. Cadenas from Santa Cruz Community Ventures, MariaElena DelaGarza from Community Action Board, and Paulina Moreno, also from Community Action Board, the Thriving Immigrants Initiative. And I am one of your hosts, your coffee chat hosts, Nicole Young, and I'm a local consultant. And I'll say a little bit more about my role in just a moment, but I'm also joined by my co-host.
Good morning, this is Nicole Lezin, the other Nicole.
And we are really enjoying these coffee chats that we've been now holding for, I think, about a month, and seeing a variety of people. I recognize some of you from previous core chats, coffee chats, and also see some new faces as well. So welcome to everybody. We always like to start off with a joint hello before everybody mutes themselves. We encourage people to turn their cameras on, even just for this brief hello, because it's nice to see actual faces. And everybody look at your cameras and wave and smile and pretend that we're all face to face for a moment. And great, thank you all. And some of you have heard, we start everybody off on mute just to minimize some of the background noise, but there will be times when we might invite you to unmute yourself to ask a question or respond to something, but also encourage you to use the chat box to keep the conversation going even while someone else is speaking. So let me just tell you and do our usual little overview of CORE and how these coffee chats came to be. So CORE stands for the Collective of Results and Evidence-Based Investments. And some of you probably are familiar with CORE as a funding model that the county and city of Santa Cruz adopted a few years ago to fund safety net services. But in the last few years, Nicole, Lezin, and I, and a few other team members have really been working with a number of partners from local government and philanthropy and nonprofits and community members to broaden that definition. So it's not just a funding model and a way to allocate grants, but it really is trying to build a movement to create equitable health and well-being that's across our community, across the lifespan. And so when we say equitable health and well-being, we really are striving towards this vision where everyone in our community has opportunities to be thriving and resilient, and that we all share responsibility for that. And so these coffee chats have been a great way to bring people together to talk about what are, particularly right now, what are some of those pressing, urgent needs that we could take some collective action around to support our whole community. And part of our kind of core movement and core framework or way of thinking about collective impact and collective action is by thinking about these, what we call these core conditions for health and well-being, and these various dimensions of life, and really emphasizing how interconnected they are, how interdependent they are. And so when we talk about, and I'm sure today we'll touch on multiple of these core conditions, particularly where there are gaps and challenges, as well as bright spots in terms of access to stable, affordable housing and shelter, or economic security and mobility, and community connectedness, particularly for members of our undocumented community. And so that's been largely the purpose of initiating this core coffee chats, that we wanted to, again, because we were hearing so many people asking and wondering, you know, what's happening in response to COVID-19? How do we coordinate and connect people to resources? What can we be doing? So that's partly how these coffee chats came to be, but these coffee chats are going to be part of kind of a broader umbrella that we're calling the Core Institute for Innovation and Impact, which really just means it's kind of an umbrella for all the various training and learning and capacity building efforts that already have existed under CORE, some of the trainings that we've offered in the past, or new opportunities that some of you might have ideas for or want to be part of. And so think of the Core Institute as just this broad umbrella for doing more of these kinds of things, where we can build shared knowledge and skills and capacity across all different partners. And so again, today we're really grateful to have Maria and MariaElena and Paulina join us to share what they know and have a conversation with us about resources that are available, as well as what else is still needed to support members of our community who are undocumented or in mixed immigration status families. And so we wanted to start off today with a little poll to get a sense of what brought you here today to the coffee chat. What are you most interested in learning today? So I'm going to ask you to take a moment to read the question and the response options and pick the one that feels most accurate to you. Are you most interested in learning about specific ways to serve undocumented individuals and families during and after COVID-19? Are you interested in joining others in local advocacy and policy efforts, or sharing information in your networks about UndocuFund Monterey Bay, or all of the above? Or are you interested in something else? And if it's something else, go ahead and select that option and then type something in the chat box to let us know what that is, so we can try to touch on that today. So I'll give you a couple more moments to think about your answers, fill out the poll, and then I'll close it and share the results. So we can see about 3/4 of you have responded already. A few more responses are coming in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Someone got their response in right on time, right as I was closing it. So we can see that a lot of you are saying all of the above, that you're interested in learning about specific ways to serve people, advocacy and policy efforts, UndocuFund Monterey Bay. So you're in the right place. We're going to cover all of those things. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to get us started with our first question.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. I also see that in addition to the poll results, there were, in addition to all of the above, Sarah's saying that she's interested in the intersectionality of issues around immigration with other United Way initiatives. That's great. I think we'll have a lot of that discussed during these 3 questions. So the first question just relates to some of the efforts that we're aware of. We know that there have been a lot of efforts to respond to community members' immediate needs for food, housing, assistance, childcare, various other needs. So there have been things like the COVID-19 grants that nonprofits have been receiving from the Community Foundation. There have been grassroots efforts like Senderos. I think Carolyn's on the call this morning, Cradle to Career, to connect families to basic needs, and then things like the food and supplies donation drive for farm workers that Assemblymember Rivas organized last weekend. So some of these have been for the community at large, and some have been specifically for people who are undocumented or in, as Nicole said, in the mixed status families. But we're interested in hearing from our panelists about particular worries and challenges that they're aware of in this community, but also the bright spots that might be emerging or that they're aware of. And we welcome your chats, your comments through the chat function, and Nicole and I will track those, and we'll have a chance after we pose our questions to the panelists to hear more from you. So I'm going to ask Paulina to weigh in first. Paulina, do you want to share what you've been seeing and hearing?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I wanted to thank CORE and Nicole for bringing attention to this important conversation. I think that, even before this pandemic, we knew that there were obviously, I think this pandemic has exposed even further some of the inequities that we are seeing with the communities that we serve. And so I appreciate having a focus on what are some of the needs that we're seeing with the undocumented communities that we serve. Even again, before this pandemic, we knew that the majority of the undocumented community was overwhelmingly, working in low-wage jobs, that they had very little access to health coverage. And so I think there's something to say about the lack of statistics and accurate information that we have that can really help us inform some of the disproportionate impacts that have resulted from this COVID-19 pandemic. I wanted to share that, through Community Action Board, for the last weeks, we've been able to create some sort of assessment where many of our programs are actually engaging with families and directly asking them what has been the impact that they have experienced as a result of COVID-19. And one of the things that, because I've also been engaged in those conversations with families, that I thought was really important to share is that what a family recently told me is that they're not afraid of the virus, that they're afraid, that their greatest fear is hunger. Their greatest fear is losing their home and becoming homeless, and becoming ill and not having access to medical attention. That is what their greatest fear is. And so, I feel that for many of the families that we have engaged and have asked, some of the things that we've heard are that, some of them have not been working for over a month since the shelter in place came into effect here in our county. Some of them have, lost, obviously as the result of not working, is two incomes being lost in one household, is not being able to support their children as they're now having to pivot how their child is now participating through the educational system, is not being able to, leave the house because they share one car, and the person that can still manage to work, that family cannot go out to access resources because they're home. And so, I share some of these things because I'm hoping that they're not new, that it's not something new that you all are hearing for the first time, but these are the realities that our families are currently experiencing, and that have, many of them have experienced, but now as a result of not having access to income or not having access to any of the relief efforts that are happening through the federal government, are that much more worrisome. And so I know I'm sharing space, so I wanted to leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Paulina.
Mm-hmm.
Maria,
Mm-hmm.
what would you add to what Paulina shared?
I think thank you everybody for having us and having this conversation. What Paulina said is true. The issues that we're seeing were present before. What COVID-19 did was bring a very sharp focus to the inequities that we see our communities facing. And I think that we feel it. And the other piece that is a little bit less intangible is the mental health stress to the families. Undocumented families were already really stressed out after 4 years of anti-immigrant sentiment at the federal level that was being manifested by them decreasing their access to healthcare, decreasing their access to food, and just basic needs services. And this was in mixed status households where children might have Social Security, but the parents didn't, or vice versa. And so that it just created a community that was already fearful and stressed. So what I've been hearing is that continuation of stress of like, where's my food gonna come from, but also a lot of anger and resentment of the dehumanization that they were facing as a population and as people. What I've heard is, I'm a taxpayer, I'm paying my taxes. Why am I being left out? Why am I being ignored? And so all the worries that the parents have of like, am I taking care of the household? Am I gonna get kicked out? All these moratoriums around evictions, for example, the undocumented community is fearful because they don't have formal leases. They're sharing 5 families to a household. They're renting a room or garage. And they feel they really don't have a resource to defend an eviction, even though they have the right not to be evicted. They don't feel like they have the atmosphere around them to support them or easy access to the legal representation to help them navigate that. So I do think that there's this constant mental health stressor aspect of it that is just compounded on top of the financial pressures of families. And families are mixed status and also mixed industry. So you might have a father who's able to work in the fields, but a mom that was cleaning houses that no longer has a job, right? So the whole household is feeling that kind of stressor. So I would say the bright spots, just to cover that a little bit. I think the community recognition of our undocumented friends as part of our social fabric, as neighbors and coworkers, has really been important. That we do not victimize, but rather stand together. And I think that language and that framework really stand up. One of the unintended consequences of UndocuFund that I receive from callers has been a gratefulness of calling out and bringing visibility to the undocumented community as part of the conversation. Sometimes when we say we serve everybody, that actually hides the inequities that might be present. And by calling it out, the community felt seen and heard and appreciated, even though they knew that, we're doing the best we can. We're not going to be able to fund and support everybody in need. But I think the bright spot is that sense of recognition of the humanity in every single one of us, including our undocumented friends.
Okay. Thanks, Maria. MariaElena, anything to add?
Yeah, buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to have this coffee chat. I think what I would add to what my colleagues have shared is just a really tangible example that we've seen at Community Action Board through our Day Worker Center. And this hit really early on in this pandemic, where we saw an immediate decrease of job matches for our day worker centers. So on an average week, in an average month, on an average year, we see about 100 to 150 job matches per week where people call and request support, have a job available like landscaping or painting the fence or moving their UCSC student or helping with house cleaning, about 100 to 150 on an average week. In high season, all the way up to 250 calls per week. And these jobs are dispatched per week. With the onset of this pandemic, we saw a serious decline of job matches, as you can imagine, to 5 in a week, to 6 in a week. And so what in a normal year, the day worker community has been able to generate through work over $300,000 to sustain itself, their families and their families in their community, in this response went down to hardly anything. And so for me, sharing that narrative is a tangible example of families who don't have access to resources, that don't have the privilege of working from home, that don't have access to revenue that helps support their children, because many of our day workers are parents. And that's an immediate response. And so I share that story because it gives you in numbers what that means for this particular segment in our county. In terms of bright spots, there's been many. One example is how many mask makers are out there. And they're sending us, along with other agencies, masks to get to the day workers, to get to our farm worker families, to get to our homeless youth. That to me is huge. I get chills just thinking about it. I think about the people who have organized, like the Community Foundation, like UndocuFund Monterey Bay. These systems have pivoted, and the system Maria and Community Ventures have created to help support getting resources to people immediately. Talk about we've created no barrier systems that didn't exist before. And with that, with the Day Worker Center specifically, we were able to this was early on, maybe within 8 days of me reaching out to people, there was funding available to pay April rent for the day workers. That's huge. No barriers. They don't have to be on the lease. It was that quick, right? And I got to give a shout out. I know Ruby's here and Paulina and some of the teachers. The caravan of gratitude that is happening that just got national attention. Talk about a bright spot. To at the very core, There's a caravan of people that, if you haven't heard about it, there's a caravan of people who get together on weekends to drive in the fields with signs saying, thank you, you are essential to the farm worker community. I mean, I get choked up just talking about it. And how that has grown and how that has gotten national attention is absolutely a piercing bright spot in this pandemic.
Great. Thanks for that. And thanks to all of you for sharing both the needs and some bright spots. I'm going to turn it back to Nicole Young for working through our second question.
Our next question is about what are some of the specific local, state, and if there are any federal resources available for undocumented individuals and families. And some of them have been mentioned. There were some questions coming through the chat around things like food distribution sites and curiosity about how funds from UndocuFund Monterey Bay actually get distributed. So, Maria, I'm going to ask you to start us off first, answering this question about, sharing some of the resources that you know about, and then we'll see what Paulina and MariaElena have to add to that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So at the local level, the COVID-19 relief fund by the Community Foundation has been great in raising funds that goes to agencies that are on the ground immediately and helping them both operational and programmatically deliver services to families in need, including some undocumented families. The distribution by them is a little different than UndocuFund. UndocuFund was a collaborative effort by predominantly service agencies that were dealing with undocumented communities already. And funnily enough, about 7 of the 9 partners are Latino-led, 8 of the 9 are people color-led. So this is by the community, for the community, quick collaboration, where each of the agencies, thanks to grants like from the Community Foundation, could offer free case management work. So every single penny that's coming to UndocuFund is going straight back into the families. We also negotiated a really low rate with our credit card provider for online donations. So really it's 0.05% in fees. So it's just direct aid, immediate direct financial relief for families, managed through the case management of our partners. So our partners are doing the case management, so the interviews and the qualifications, and then distributing the cash. Part of what UndocuFund is trying to do right now, and what Community Ventures is figuring out, is how do we do direct deposits so it's as close to cash as we can. Visa cards have high fees and they're not accepted everywhere, like your landlord. Gift cards might require traveling and gas money that the families may not have. So we're really working with our partners to get as close to cash as we can to families' financial assistance quickly, so they can get them. So it's really money in, money out, from donors to families, and it's based on need and capacity. So we work with the partners, and I tell people I'm grateful for the donors and for the partners, because we built this, like MariaElena said, this is a huge system that we did in 2 weeks. And that it requires a lot of trust, but a lot of commitment on what the priority is, which is helping families. So UndocuFund just collects the money. We help process it through Community Ventures. We're donating all of our administrative staff to do this. The partners are donating their case management work to do that. And then the money goes out to the families based on need and what we hear, both in Santa Cruz and Monterey County. And depending on funding, we want to expand into San Benito, because that's a large geographic reach that we can do. Our partners reach all those counties, so we feel we have the capacity to do that. There's not much in the federal level in terms of aid. There are other independent funds across the state that people can tap into. What we want to do is minimize how many touch points a potential client needs to touch. We don't want them to call 5 different agencies. We don't want them to call different funds. So we're trying to centralize all that information. That'll be coming live on the DocuFundMB.org in the next 2 days. So people can just go scroll through and see what resources are available. The state sent out their ask, right? So they have $75 million from state funds that will be distributed in one-time gifts of $500 for individuals or $1,000 per family. We're expecting that money, ideally, if the state can manage their processes, that money should be going out in late May, early June, I would assume, depending on their timelines. That would go into contracts with the 16 CDOs, and MariaElena and Paulina can probably go a little bit deeper into that. There is another pool of money that's still undefined on how it would reach our local communities, and that's 50 million that will be from independent philanthropy. So I'm talking to that group and figuring out how we can share the need in our rural and Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay area to get funding to our families, because we have a high cost of living, and we have industry like service, hospitality, and agriculture, which are severely impacted. I would say outside of resources, Nicole, one of the things that is really important is the policy work that's happening. So I'm excited about the level of collaboration that's happening, not only locally, but statewide. At the policy level, what the governor did was really important, but it's only a start. There's about over 2 million undocumented families in the state. This government policy would only support 125,000 plus whatever number the 50 million can support. So if we can advocate for access to Medi-Cal for all, regardless of status, if we can advocate for the expansion of the California Earned Income Tax Credit to all taxpayers, so it's not limited. Right now, that credit's not available to undocumented households, even if the undocumented person is the child. So think about that. If you have a mixed status household with one child that's not documented, they don't receive that credit. And we want to really push for a relief fund or a permanent unemployment type insurance fund that can support all workers who become unemployed or lose income. So from a policy standpoint, there's a lot to do. There is an additional concern, how we come out. And so there's efforts at the policy front to look at reentry into the workforce. If you were laid off from a hotel or from a cleaning service or a landscaping service, if that employer asks you for real ID in order to come back to work, then we're looking at a permanent unemployment status for those that previously had been employed. And then the economic hardship becomes much more longer and harder to do. So what I ask, I guess, our guest today is that there's a piece that we need to do as a service provider, as partners and leaders, but there's a huge piece that we need to lift our voices at a policy front to speak to representatives, to think about how we ensure the economic stability of our region by making sure our undocumented workers continue to be able to find employment.
Thanks, Maria. MariaElena, I know that you have a little bit of information to share about the resources from the state that Maria just mentioned, and that's the PDF that I just added to the chat box. So MariaElena, do you want to tell us what you know about those funds?
Sure. Thank you for sharing that link. That's the fact sheet that was released, I believe, about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, from the state regarding what they can share right now in terms of the funding that is available from the governor's office. So what's important to know is that they broke up California in regions. And we are part of the Central Coast region, and we share that with Monterey, San Benito, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. So we're one of those counties in the Central Coast region. And of the $75 million, 8%, and they calculated this based on number of undocumented people that they believe that we have, and so 8% of that funding, which equals $5 million, will be focused for the Central Coast. And again, I want to say $5 million across that region. Oh, there it is. Thank you. And so if you look at that in terms of what does that mean in numbers, we're looking at 10,000 people across the entire region. And if we break down the numbers through percentages, we're looking at 1,000 people in Santa Cruz County. That's not a lot. It's something, and we're grateful, and it's not enough. It's 1,000 people that we can help in this community with up to $500, right? And so the state has not rolled out its plan in terms of what it is going to take to be eligible for that funding. We believe they haven't selected the service providers where that funding is coming through yet. And we've been notified with for the people who received the fact sheet that they're looking at launching their program possibly May 15th. So we're about 2 weeks away at this point. to hear about their system, their selection process in terms of agencies to facilitate this funding through, and what their eligibility requirements are. I mean, I'm a little worried about what that looks like on a statewide level. I want to add to this question around some of the local conversation that we, along with other entities, have had a meeting with the Ag Commissioner, our county Ag Commissioner, which was a really good meeting, but it was an initial meeting, and there needs to be focus on continued planning for our community. We've heard from Ventura and our neighborhood counties about farm workers testing positive. And we know that it's inevitable, and there's a need, and there's an opportunity for us to create a local plan to respond for our local ag workers. And so there is not a plan in place yet, unless somebody on the call knows something more that has developed within the last couple of days. But I think we need to have some attention around that. And then the last thing I'll mention before I pass it on to Paulina is we've been in conversation with Vu, who's the blogger, the nonprofit AF blogger. Thanks to Keisha, I don't know if Keisha's on the line, but Keisha made a comment on Facebook, and he was intrigued by the narrative around the day workers. And wanted to learn more, and so we've been in conversation with him and bringing the national, the ENDALON, the National Organization of Day Workers. There's about 70 day worker centers across the nation, and we're actually planning some fundraising to help support the day worker centers network across the nation. And so it's preliminary. We've been meeting every week to kind of plan what this might look like. But I can tell you that the goal is to raise $50 million. And so more to come as that gets rolled out through that process.
It's exciting. Talk about a bright spot. Paulina, do you have anything to add to what Maria and MariaElena have covered?
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is that, as the state continues to, be asked to have a focus specifically on undocumented families, the state has really created some very helpful resources in terms of specific to immigrant communities. And so I would just, and maybe I'll copy the link to the chat, but there are various tools that the state has developed that includes information regarding information that most of us already have, but I think it's important to highlight as well, which is, in terms of encouraging people to use their local 211s, where to receive assistance for food efforts, healthcare, wages and benefits as it relates to immigrant communities. As Maria and MariaElena mentioned, unfortunately, if you don't already know, mixed status families are ineligible to be part of the stimulus relief efforts. And so even if, if one person filed with an ITIN, that makes the family ineligible to receive the $1,200 stimulus check. And so we're excited to learn about these efforts that are happening through the state and the organizing that is happening to bring resources to support our local families. Because as MariaElena mentioned, the percentages, when we begin to break them down, it's not enough. And so I just wanted to make a really quick pitch for and to put it on people's radar, because as Maria mentioned earlier, the lack of access to healthcare, and for me that's also obviously healthcare that includes social emotional support. And one thing that even before this pandemic that a lot of our immigrant community was already fearful of was this administration's new intended public charge rule, which we knew had already some effects. We don't know for certain that the disenrollment from CalFresh in our county is a direct result of public charge, but there's evidence to suggest that it's in direct correlation, right? That that this public charge rule has really heightened people's stress and fear that if they receive any public benefits, if they have access to food, if they have access to medical attention, that will impact their immigration status. And so we think that's super important. You know, the federal government released some information related to public charge that if the undocumented community, the immigrant community is experiencing health issues as they relate to COVID-19, that they can seek medical attention without fear that it will then be used against them as a public charge. And so, you know, we do have something that we'll be scheduling a conversation with community members on May 19th. So I just wanted to put that on your radar. May 19th at 10 a.m. We'll be going in depth a little bit more into what the implications of public charge, and so you can learn more about it. So I did want to highlight that, and I did want to add one additional thing that, you know, we've been trying to put together communications that emphasize local resources. And so we did put out a communication on late March, that we're planning to in the next week, that has an updated list of just resources that are available locally where you all can make reference to individuals for. I think that, you know, as people continue to experience fear around their status, that it's important to reemphasize where they can go for assistance. You know, the immigration project here at CAB continues to operate. We're providing consultations via phone. We're continuing to provide legal assistance. So I think it's important to make sure that the community realizes that they can continue to receive that level of assessment.
Great, thank you all for sharing that. And yes, any links or documents that you want to either share through the chat or send us afterwards, we'll make sure they get included in the follow-up email that we send to everyone as well. Nicole, you want to move on to the third question?
Sure. So as you've been hearing, lots of individuals and organizations have come together in our community to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And we've been hearing more and more about people trying to use this as an opportunity within the crisis to change programs and policies and systems that have been stuck for a long time in very unequitable ways. So we wanted to borrow this wording from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation about what we can do collectively today to create a better and more equitable tomorrow, and to pose that question to our panelists. So MariaElena, do you want to start us off with your reflections on this?
Sure, thank you for that. I think this is a fantastic question, and my core, I have a core response, and my core response isn't rocket science. It is just, how do we keep in alignment with our personal values in this response? Who are we? What do we value? What is important to us? And how do we align with movements, agencies, and opportunities that match with those values? And if we can do that on a daily basis, then equity happens and change happens. You know, I want to highlight to things that you know, this question made me think about. You know, yes, we know that we have a housing crisis, and how do we, in our housing development plans, ensure that there's low-income housing as part of that? It's not about affordable housing for our undocumented families. It's about low-income housing. It's about access to those opportunities. How do we partner with our educational friends, right? Ruby and the teachers and COE and the school district to help to understand how we as community members can help our families help their kids in this online time, right? I mean, my father was illiterate. There's no way that given this time, we could have made it through in our educational system, you know, with my educational system. So I think that's a topic for another coffee chat, right? How do we partner? What do our educational partners need from us right now to help our families? You know, how do we, you know, Paulina and I checked in about this. Has our county electeds, our city electeds, have they communicated a stance for undocumented families in our community, right? Could we organize around a share of a foundational, foundational values around how we as a community are going to support our undocumented families? And the last one, which Nancy from Regeneración put on my radar through a casual conversation, or through a Facebook conversation. Can you imagine if everybody who got a stimulus check, if each of us who got a stimulus check assessed our need for that stimulus check, our personal need, and then decided what we could share with someone else who didn't get a stimulus check? Rose Felicetti, for her birthday, created a fundraiser to help support undocumented families through Facebook. Thank you, Rose. I'm getting chills on that one, Rose. Do you know that it's that simple to create equity pathways? It's that simple.
Thanks, MariaElena, for that inspiring roundup and reflection. Paulina, what would you like to add to what MariaElena shared?
Yes, thank you, MariaElena. It's always hard to go after MariaElena. But one thing that I wanted to maybe call attention to, I think earlier on, was Sarah's comment about the intersectionality of our work. As the director of the Thriving Immigrants Initiative, we've been working on what I think has been a framework for how we can do and be better in Santa Cruz County around organizing for the immigrant community, for and with the immigrant community. And so, we just had our immigration convergence on February 21st, where it was really our opportunity to unveil, what this strategic plan, if you want to call it, our strategic plan around what are some of the areas that we'd like to focus on. And, the two main things that came up for us are, of course, as MariaElena mentioned, advocacy and, changing the narrative. And so, for me, it's using this opportunity to build those allegiances of, through our shared values, through our shared work, and really, how do we begin to connect our work, right? Because we recognize that our, families are complex, that our work can no longer happen in silos, that we need to come together because we're serving the same community. And so how does our work with immigration also intersect with the work that is happening in the detention centers and the prisons? And so I'd love to invite you all to a conversation around how we can, align, and who is moved by some of these strategic priorities, and who wants to be part of helping to advocate. I think Maria mentioned two great things that CAB has been a part of through our Immigrant Day of Action, which is actually every May we go together with a group of immigrant rights nonprofits, and we advocate. We meet with legislators, and we have a policy agenda. Last year was around Health for All and Cal ITC, and this year it will continue to be around Health for All and Cal ITC. Immigrant Day was originally scheduled for May 11th, where we take a group of delegates, day workers, community members, and we go to Sacramento. And it's a beautiful thing with over 500 organizations throughout the entire state. And so, I'd like to continue that and invite you all to be part of a conversation of aligning our work. And so I'm going to put another date on your radar, which is May 14th at 9 a.m. I will send more information. But if you're moved to really explore how we can come together and create work on advocacy together and help change the narrative, around our immigrant community, I want to extend the invitation. And again, I'll send more information, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Paulina. Feel free to put some of those dates and ideas in the chat, and then we'll also send them with follow-ups to the chat today. Thanks. Maria, how about you? What are your reflections on this question?
As I'm sitting here listening to the great work and initiatives, I'm thinking about how we approach equity. You know, at least at Community Ventures, I joke we don't have a tagline, but we're a systems shaker. You know, at Ventures, our thought is, you know, let's not fix what's broken. Let's create what needs to be created to build the communities we want, and that includes our economy. A lot of what we're seeing, whether it's undocumented workers or low-income workers, is a huge wealth gap due to an uneven distribution of the wealth being created through our communities, you know, whether it's through labor, through use of our land, through use of our resources. We don't have living wages. When the majority of our population doesn't have $500 in their bank account and an emergency like COVID happens, this is what happens. When our small businesses can't thrive and 1 month of cash flow means that we might have completely eliminated social fabrics that are critical in our county, this is what happens. I think for me, when I think about to create a more equitable tomorrow, it means embracing the imagination and the creativity to think outside of the structures we've been working on. In the short term, we have to be relief, we have to be immediate, but we have to be thinking medium to long term. What does it look like? What does a local economy look like that reflects those equitable values? You know, what does it mean to have a society that embraces everybody regardless of status? You know, what does it look like? What does the policy look like? What's the capital lending models look like? You know, right now, how we lend, how we provide support is by those that have to those that don't. And the return on investments is always higher to those that have than those that don't. Let's rethink it, let's flip it. If we're gonna offer community bonds to our small business owners, what does it mean? Who gets what? Who gets priority? We saw it with the Payroll Protection Act that happened. Where did most of that money went to? Who was left out? We need to be asking those questions of the systems that we're asking to act in relief so that we actually create equity. Because it's not just about those that are being served, that have been traditionally left out. It's about really how do we create the systems we want to live into tomorrow. And for me, when we started launching UndocuFund, what we had available at the table were great assets, great leaders, great organizations. But I can tell you, as I'm an immigrant myself, I came when I was 10 years old, you know, even so, I'm not undocumented right now. And I have shelter and I can work from home. So at UndocuFund, one of the biggest questions we have to hurdle, even as we're building this, is how do we ensure that the ones that decide how this money is given out, the ones that decide how it's being distributed, are those that are benefiting from it. So that we can get undocumented voices be the ones that determine how we help undocumented people. That's equity. Right? And that will take time. And how do we make sure that as we involve their voices, they get paid for the experience and talent that allows for that planning to take place? Because I'm getting paid, MariaElena is getting paid. So if we're going to ask a community to be the ownership of that voice and ensure that they use their power, they need to also be paid. And I think those are the type of questions that we're thinking about. How do we do tomorrow more equitable? Let's ask about that. You know, I used to be in philanthropy, and in philanthropy, let me tell you, philanthropy gets its money by the very system that creates the inequities. With all due respect and love for everything that's happening in philanthropy, but I was there and I know how it happens. And usually the decisions are made by those that had the power and the money to give it out to those that didn't. These are times for different conversations. These are times to talk about how we distribute wealth, how we question it, who makes those decisions, and how we make sure that everybody has the economic power and mobility to do that. This is a conversation about living wages, universal income, universal common property, different ways of looking at housing that includes common own. Let's look at cooperatives. Let's look at different ideas and imagine, and then work through that goal. Because there's work that needs to be done in the short term that is just about stabilization. You know, and yes, lead with values and lead with heart, because I think it's about recognizing our humanness to each other. But as we come out of this, if all we do is sustain it and go back to the old models, then we haven't taken this opportunity where it needs to be going. So to create a more equitable tomorrow, we have to challenge our own assumptions, our own comfort zones, And for those that have power or those that have access and those that have a voice, we have to learn to pass the baton and step aside. And I think that to me is what's important.
Thanks, Maria, for reminding us of the many different meanings of equity and for encouraging us to think about a different way of looking at what's possible for tomorrow. We wanted to create some space in our conversation today for your questions and reactions to what the panelists have shared. And I want to thank MariaElena, Paulina, and Maria for such reflections and provocative ideas, as well as sharing some concrete resources. So one question that's come up in the chat is just how we can spread the word about some of these resources and make sure that they're getting to the right place and the right people. So for those of you who are sharing ideas about new resources or connections to resources through the chat, thanks. We'll make sure that gets back out to everybody. And if you have other questions for the panelists or for each other, please share those through the chat as well. And we'll try to pose the questions to our panelists and monitor what comes up through the chat as well in the time that we have left here.
And Maria, actually, could you cover just fairly quickly the almost like the logistics of how do families find out about or access some of the resources through UndocuFund, and who are those partner organizations? So like if a client was already getting services through one of those partner organizations, do they just automatically get offered that, or how do some of those logistics work?
We're still figuring everything out. Again, 2 weeks. But right now, how it's working with the cash flow that came in right away is we, in essence, gave grants, right, from the UndocuFund to the partners who had case management capacity. That's Catholic Charities, Community Bridges, Community Action Board, Pajaro Valley Prevention and Student Assistance, and Salud para la Gente. So they, and then Monarch Services is doing that as well. So they got, in essence, the funding went to them into their existing way for them to determine as partners how, in essence, to minimize the administrative cost of the program to families that they serve and prioritize and they needed to be served. So mostly low income. Some organizations are not asking immigration status. We're asking them to ask if they qualified for the federal stimulus and unemployment. And if they don't, then they get qualified for UndocuFund, right? So that's how we do that. And it's really through each agency's case management process. The funds can be used for any purpose. We're not putting restrictions. They tell us, the recipients can tell us if they're using it for rent, if they're using it for transportation, utilities, food, whatever. So we have a sense of where the money is going, but we believe that people who are in need know most where they can use the money. We have a central dashboard, basically. So my program staff is monitoring the dashboard, and then we know what partner is getting low on funds. And we'll be issuing a phone line this week, so people can call into the phone line and ask about it, and then we can direct them to the agency that makes the most sense. And so it really is trying to each partner, and what we call no wrong door. So if they go straight into CAB, instead of calling us, that's okay. If CAB doesn't have resources, they get in a wait list, and then we are starting to notify my staff so they can redirect them as needed. We've also talked about if the funds are available in one agency, but not in another one that has high need, we'll just transfer the funds, if that makes sense. So it's really a collaborative effort to make it as easy as possible for the recipient. Some other funds in other regions have done an open call, like they open it online and they have an online application. Right now, the thought from the partnership, and MariaElena and Paulina, correct me if I'm wrong, is that that's not necessarily equitable because of the digital divide that we have in the county. So that those with access to computers will get all of the entry first, and there's so much need, and there'll be nothing for those that are not. So we haven't done that. We saying let's go through them, through the agencies to seek support. And then the other piece that's pending, but we want to solve it in the next week and a half, is, like I said, direct deposit for people who might not be able to go to the agencies, because there's a lot of areas in Monterey Bay that are agencies, although they're broad, they're not covering. Big Sur is one of those, right? Some of the rural areas in Monterey County. So we want to make it easy for those communities through alliances with partners that are on the ground to refer people to the phone line and then figure out how do we do the case management for them, even though the agency might not be physically accessible because of distance or other purposes. But right now, I tell people, we can't serve everybody. We're doing the best we can. The reason we really want to do it with our partners is because even if we run out of funds at UndocuFund, our partners have the food pantry information, some have secured additional other no barrier funding. So there's ways that at least they'll get something by going through our partners. And that is the thought process around that.
Maria, this is MariaElena. Can you share how easy it is to donate to UndocuFund Monterey Bay, please?
Yeah, go to UndocuFundMB.org and click donate. That's really it. Like I said, everything is through a credit card. If you want to do a check, there's a check address that you can send a check. We ask if you want to do more than $1,000, do a check, so we don't even pay that 0.5%. It's just helpful. So that's it. If you want to do stock donations, we can take that as well. It really is a matter of 3 clicks, use your credit card, and you're golden.
And I just want to say too, and we're right up against our closing time, but also I think particularly because we know that, even between the state and whatever federal resources are available, all these local donations, that it still will not be enough, right? So the more we can think about how do we collectively respond, what are all the different ways that we can infuse resources into the community, both now during the immediate crisis, but always be thinking about, and what does that tomorrow need to look like? What do we need to be creating now for that tomorrow? I think all three of you, MariaElena, Paulina, and Maria, spoke to that so eloquently. And I don't know about all of you, but I'm feeling like we are ready to go. We're ready to go change the world, right? So encourage everyone to stay in touch with each other. There are a few more questions that have come through the chat that we will ask our guests to maybe answer for us, so we can send that as part of the follow-up with the link to today's recording. Since we are just about ready to close, and we do want to ask everyone to take a moment to fill out the feedback survey on SurveyMonkey. You can either click on the link in the chat box now, and it opens up a web browser to fill out the survey, and you can always do that even after this meeting ends. We'll also send it out in the follow-up email. We really value and try to learn from the feedback. It helps us plan future coffee chats. So we encourage you to take a moment to fill that out, please. And thank you all so much. Ruby has some great closing words. Much love to this powerful group of women and men on the call. Thank you for your service to our community. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you again at another coffee chat.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.